What's up, people? My name is Shaggy, the opinionated hippie. I started this channel to devote it to all things Frank Zappa, and we are now operating under the Frank Zappa The Big Note umbrella, and we are going to deep dive the rabbit hole. That sounds weird. Of Bob Dylan. So we're going to go down the Bob Dylan rabbit hole. How is he part of the Frank Zappa Big Note? Well, we have the song Flakes, in which there is a Bob Dylan tribute, mockery, satire, homage, impersonation, rip off of, I don't care, whatever. But Adrian Belew does a fantastic sort of Bob Dylan impersonation in Flakes. We also have that extending through live versions of that. Plus, in '88, we got the sort of Torture Never Stops Part 1 sort of Dylan thing in there. Want to buy some cave paintings, Bob? So we got that. Plus, I would argue that they are, Frank and Dylan are both musicians that are 100% themselves almost always. Yes, some producers did some horrible things to Bob in the '80s, but he overcame it, and he reforged his identity in the '90s and onwards. So I think it would be interesting to see. Like, I think both the '80s got the worst of Frank and Dylan, but Dylan, of course, made it through the '90s and the new millennium. And so it would have been interesting to see where Frank would have gone, and he survived the horrible '80s and what that sound did to music. But anyways, another connection, though a loose one, is that Freak Out would have been the first ever rock double album if Blonde on Blonde had not been released exactly 1 week earlier. So I always find that connection to be, yeah, a little something. But anyways, yeah, so we're going down the Dylan rabbit hole. This is going to be 4 videos only because I tend to talk too much, as I already am talking too much. And I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to do these by tiers. So we have S tier, A tier, S tier, A tier, B tier, C tier albums. I don't think Dylan has a D tier album. Those bottom 2 are maybe C minuses, but the bottom 2 on this list, one of them is forgettable, I think, is its worst sin. The other one is truly horrible at times, but has one track that is possibly one of his best, and a handful, 2 other tracks that I don't think are that bad. So nothing here I think is D tier for Dylan. Only doing 31 albums, studio albums, not doing live albums, not doing the bootleg series, not doing any albums that are 100% covers. There is way too much music in the world for me to waste any time listening to Bob Dylan sing other people's songs. I have heard all of them. There are 6 by my counting. Well, one is like 5 by my counting. One is like an outtakes album. One has covers that I'm going to include, but has a couple originals. If there's originals on it, I'm going to include it. Self-Portrait, which I actually like. So I'm not doing the 5 from like the 2 from the '90s, World Gone Wrong, or Good Enough to Me. I always forget the name of that one. Whatever that one is from the '90s. I kind of liked World Gone Wrong and listened to that a couple times, but for the most part, I'm not doing any of the 3 that were released. Fallen Angels, Shadows in the Night, and Triplicate, I think they are. Not doing the Christmas album. Never listen to the Christmas album. I will never listen to a Christmas album. It is a Christmas album. Yeah, that might be D tier Christmas albums, but I'm not even going to do that. So anyways, we got the 31 quote unquote studio albums without all that sort of other stuff in there. My experience with Dylan, I do not have a single memory of my mom's car growing up that did not contain either Linda Ronstadt's Simple Dreams or Bob Dylan's Blood on the Tracks on cassette. I knew Blood on the Tracks, every single note of that by the time I hit high school. One of my mom's favorite albums. I got Biograph, I think for either my Christmas or birthday, the year that came out, mid '80s. That was when I jumped down the Dylan rabbit hole. My stepdad, who had a massive vinyl collection, only had the '60s albums, so those were the things I mainly listened to over and over and over again. He also had the basement tapes. So I listened to those, and that was it. And then once I got into college is when I started getting into more Dylan. I've seen him about a dozen plus times over the years. Still think he's easily one of the greatest artists of all time. But anyways, let's jump in to the C tier Bob Dylan albums. When I'm done, comment however you want. You know how comments work. We're all adults here. Comment in a kind, you can be critical, but let's not be mean. because I have no idea how Dylan fans are. No idea how this is going to go. We're moving from the musicality of Zappa and Crimson and what else have I done? Blue Oyster Cult, the Grateful Dead. We're moving definitely into a more lyric heavy discussion. So we'll see how that goes. Anyways, yeah, on to the first review. Number 31, Down in the Groove. This came out in 88. It's like 10 tracks, a whole bunch of guest musicians, some of them fantastic. Only 4 of the songs were penned by Dylan, 2 by Dylan by himself, 2 of them with Robert Hunter. I imagine Silvio's an okay song. That's a Hunter Dylan collaboration. The Ugliest Girl in the World is one of Dylan's worst songs, I think. It almost sounds like a really cheesy, bad Bob Weir song. I imagine Hunter maybe presented the lyrics to Weir and the Dead at some point, and they were like, oh no, we're not touching that thing. That's even worse than I Need a Miracle. But yeah, I think the worst thing about this is it's forgettable. Other than the horrible Ugliest Girl in the World, which I think is just a bad song. It's doesn't sound that bad for an 80s album. It's not as bad as, say, the next one on this list, which has a fantastic song on it. It's just kind of forgettable. I don't think it's horribly bad other than that one song, but like looking at the track list, I've probably listened to this album. I revisit it every so often. I can't remember almost anything looking at the track list. When I listen to it, I forget all of it when I'm done, other than The Ugliest Girl in the World, which just makes me sad because it's a bad song. But anyways, yeah, Down in the Groove, number 31, just a forgettable album. Number 30, Knocked Out Loaded. This came out in 86. Can't stand the sound on this album. This is one of those in which that 80s gated drum and just overall glossy production sound is just horrible. It's got one of Dylan's worst. It is a cover, Chris Christopherson's cover, but they killed him. Like, the first song is okay, Let's Ramble or something like that. It's not bad, but then they killed him. It's just good intentions, but it is a bad song. And then just horrible sounds, some bad songs. But the second side of this album, I think there's only 5 Dylan originals, 3 of them or 4 of them are co-wrote with somebody else. But the second side of this album has Brownsville Girl, which is a top 10 Dylan song. So I'm going to give away part of that list. Maybe top 10. There's a lot of really good Dylan songs. But Brownsville Girl is fantastic. There is an updated version of this that is not as horrible sounding called New Danville Girl, which was on one of the bootleg series. But even this version and the horrible sound on this horrible album raises this album up to a C tier and off the bottom of the list. There's also a song called Got My Mind Made Up. Got My Mind Made Up. Got My Mind Made Up. I think that's what it is. But it's he co-wrote with Tom Petty, and Tom Petty released his version of this on his playback box set, which I listen to a lot more. So then when I go back and visit this, I really actually like Dylan's version of this. So I think the second half of this album is not that bad, though the sound is pretty atrocious. And the first half is just either forgettable or just bad. But not D tier bad. I think the second half completely salvages this. And Brownsville Girl, hands down. He has so many songs. Top 10 is top 20, maybe top 20, maybe top 10. We'll see. Love that song. Really long, epic, rambling about this movie that he saw and just kind of how he comments on that and then goes off on these weird tangents and then ties it all back together at the end. Just a fantastic lyrical journey. Knocked Out Loaded. Number 30. Number 29, Empire Burlesque. This came out in 85. My mom did buy this one on cassette when it came out, so I remember listening to this a handful of times. I do like the opening track, Tight Connection to My Heart. I think they made a video of it and tried to make like it a hit single. Didn't really fly. The sound is atrocious. This is an 80s sounding album, especially when you get to, there's a couple longer songs like there's a side 2 has a song, Night Comes Falling from the Sky, I think is what it's called. Pretty kind of, one of his more longer, about 8 minutes, kind of lyric heavy. But again, the sound is just so ridiculously atrocious. It's so 80s. It's just so cluttered and fake and synthetic and glossy and Again, there's nothing as bad as that they killed him from the previous album, or Ugliest Girl in the World. Kind of not as forgettable. There's a couple good melodies on here and a couple kind of hooky, poppy songs. Again, we're in a very different Dylan. This is 80s Dylan. It's not the best of 80s Dylan, but it's not the worst of 80s Dylan. But it is kind of ultimately forgettable as the other two, but not as bad as their worst. So yeah, Empire Burlesque. Really got nothing else to say about this. Number 29. Number 28, Under the Red Sky. This came out in 90, but it's definitely sort of the last of the 80s albums. It's got a glossy, overproduced feel to it. Apparently he had a kid around this time, so a lot of the songs have a sort of nursery rhyme-ish, child's The Wiggles type feel. I think the first track is called Wiggle Wiggle. And I actually don't mind it. I think it's kind of fun and playful. I just think, had there been better production, and some of the songs kind of just fade out abruptly, like the opening track is just Wiggle Wiggle. It's kind of a silly throwaway number, but it fades out too early, and I think had they just gone longer and maybe produced it better, it would not be that bad of a song. There's some interesting songs on here, but again, it is one of those, it sounds horrible, you kind of have to suffer through it. None of the songs are really absolute standouts, but I don't think there's anything that's just bad on this album, where the other three that are on this list have stuff that is just outright bad. So yeah, I mean, whatever. A playful album. Dylan's trying to be a little more playful, a little more fun. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. But yeah, after this, he would take a break and do 2 cover albums, maybe like, obviously he is lost at this point in his career, so he had to do a couple covers albums to sort of refine himself, and then he would come back incredibly strong at the end of the 90s. But yeah, other than that, it's just really just, again, another one of those 80s, 1990 kind of forgettable albums, kind of lost, trying to figure things out. But I think this is better than the other 3 on this list, personally, though it doesn't have anything as incredibly fantastic as Brownsville Girl. Number 28, Under the Red Sky. Number 27, Together Through Life. This came out in 2009. Dylan co-wrote most of the 10 songs with Robert Hunter, the Grateful Dead lyricist. I just think the lyrics are just not up to the Dylan standard. The music, he's pretty much operating in his sort of straight-ahead Americana type, slightly country, slightly folk vibe. You got some accordion, you just got a lot of acoustic instruments. You got that Dylan just rough gravel that he has in like the New Millennium. Again, this is another one of those where there's nothing really bad on this album, but I do think his attempts to be a little more bluesy or a little more edgy don't work. I do think there's a couple songs on here that had the Dead at it, and Jerry delivered it in his more Jerry style. Again, the Jerry and the Dead had been done at this point. But had Hunter written these songs in like the 80s and given them to the Dead, I think they could have wrapped a different sort of musical style around some of these and made it more interesting. But for the most part, I don't think Dylan and Hunter is a good pairing. I don't think Hunter's style of lyricism works for what Dylan does. At least not on this album, and definitely not on that Knocked Out Loaded or whatever album they had that horrible song. I'm already blanking out. Those albums are so forgettable. But again, of his new stuff, I like most of his new stuff, but this one and then one more, which is coming soon, I just don't think are up to par on his other stuff. And part of it on this one is I think the lyrics. They're trying. There are moments which are kind of catchy, but for the most part, this is another forgettable album. Nothing bad on it, but nothing that if I were to make a greatest hits list or even sort of a mixtape, I'm not sure anything on this album would go on like a Dylan mixtape of sorts. But again, Knockout Loaded does have one, so maybe that should be higher. But no, the rest of that is so bad. But anyways, number 27, Together Through Life. And number 26, Oh Mercy. This came out in 1989. I know this was critically acclaimed, or at least returned to form acclaimed after the disasters that preceded it. Knocked Out Loaded, Empire Burlesque, Down in the Groove, all on this list already. Yeah, I mean, I guess it is better than those, but I don't ultimately think it's that good. Songs like Political World and Everything Is Broken sound like Dire Straits attempts to be Bob Dylan. They don't quite seem to be Dylan-worthy. Like Dylan writing a song called Political World when he has like these absolute, like everything he did in the 60s was political in some way or the other. He didn't need to actually address the fact that it's a political world. I think it's lazy Dylan here. Everything is broken. Again, there's a great concept in there. I'm not sure Dylan pulls it off. I do like The Man in the Long Black Coat. I do think there's a couple of the slower songs on here. Ring Them Bells, most of the time, though I think I came around to those when the bootlegs, there's the bootleg, one of the bootleg series has outtakes and live takes from this album. I think I like the other versions of those, but now when I listen to these, I'm like, oh yeah, this song, I like this song. But yeah, it sounds better than the other ones. It's not a complete sonic disaster. Has a good energy about it. When I listen to it, I'm not miserable, but I do think it is probably high C tier. C++, almost into the B- range. But other than The Man in the Long Black Coat, I don't think there is a song that really elevates this to the next level. So yeah, number 26, Oh Mercy. All right, so that's it for the C tier Dylan albums. So that's all I got for this time. We're going to hit the B tier next. There are quite a few in the B tier. I think that's the largest chunk of what I have. But again, I would say a B tier album with Dylan is, I will listen to that quite often. So it's still pretty solid stuff. But anyways, again, you know how comments work. Give me your list. Give me your thoughts on these. How many did I just do? 1, 2, 3, 4. These 6 albums. Why I'm wrong. Why I'm right. Why I'm an idiot. What information I missed. What song I should go back and check out on these albums that might change my mind about these albums. I would say that the best word to describe these C tier albums is they're at the worst forgettable. Again, sometimes bad, but just kind of forgettable. And so don't listen to them that much. There's nothing that compels me to go back to them. And because of Dylan's amazing bootleg series releases, I can find a lot of this stuff, the better versions of this stuff, on other releases, along with outtakes and stuff that didn't make these releases, which makes you go, what in the world? Why was that song not on this album? That would have immediately made it better. But we're not going to discuss that now because that's a whole other series of videos. Yeah, we will do the bootleg series at one point because those releases are fantastic. But yeah, that's it for now. Comment, subscribe, like, share, don't like, don't comment. But whatever you do, just be true to yourself. And yeah, I don't have a clever Dylan quote to close this out. But just remember, everything is broken, right? So why does it matter? Peace, y'all.